All right, we are live.
Janelle?
Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Black Health Trust Weekly program. My name is Janelle and I'm your host for today. It's a beautiful day in Los Angeles, California, and we hope that you all are doing well wherever you're joining us from today. Today, our panel will be moderated by the distinguished Dr. Maxey, Chief Medical Officer of Advanced Community Medical Care Corporation and co-founder of the Black Health Trust. He will introduce this wonderful co-moderator and guest today. What is our purpose, you ask? The mission of the Black Health Trust is to provide credible insights from our community health experts to best serve our communities of color with a coalition of leading and long-standing Black medical professionals across a diverse spectrum of disciplines to offer unvarnished opinions and insights into our physical and mental health during these challenging times. Before we begin, I would like to share a few housekeeping items and announcements for the program. Please be advised that the video conference is live and being recorded on different public platforms such as Facebook Live and YouTube. Your participation on this call is completely voluntary, and if you choose to stay on this call and prefer not to have your image and likeness displayed, there are visual and audio settings on your personal device that you can block your picture and mute your voice. All participants will be muted by our Zoom technician initially. We ask that you remain muted until the host or moderator asks you to contribute in order to minimize the distraction of the background noise so that we can give 100% attention to our speakers. Check and make sure your device is on mute until called on to speak, and then once again place your device back on mute when you're done speaking. As for the chat room, if you have questions, you can enter them into the chat room. Please limit your questions to 2 questions per topic being addressed, and please do not use this forum to advertise or promote your products. Understand that there may not be sufficient time to get to all of the questions during the call, but we will do our best. Be advised that the information communicated on this call is not deemed to be medical or legal advice, and you should always consult your own medical or legal professional for advice pertaining to your particular situation and needs. Black Health Trust needs you to continue bringing our community outstanding programming, critical and timely information. www.blackhealthtrust.org needs your support. Visit the website to learn more about our programming and how to support, volunteer, and/or donate so that we can get this information out to as many people as possible. Visit our website, blackhealthtrust.org, to donate via credit card with PayPal as well as with Cash App, $ Black Health Trust. Thank you and stay safe. I am a proud member of the Black Health Trust family whose mission is to provide credible information and insight from our community health experts. We are so grateful to the numerous health professionals that have donated their time to the Dynamic Sunday program since the beginning of the pandemic. Our goal is to inform and help people of color become and stay healthy. Black Health Trust is developing the structure for a well-managed nonprofit organization, and our continued success depends on your contributions. Please consider a modest donation of or more, as every dollar counts. Visit our website, www.blackhealthtrust.org, to donate via credit card with PayPal as well as Cash App. I want to thank Black Health Trust steering community, the executive board, the virtual administrative assistant, our production and Zoom technician, and all the people behind the scenes for their time and efforts that make this program possible. We want to give a big welcome to all of our distinguished physicians and special guests. We thank you for sharing your valuable time, information, and educated insights with us today. Your participation and support help to empower our communities of color, and this is critical to our present and future well-being as people. Knowledge is power. Welcome again, everyone, to the Black Health Trust Weekly program. This is our community, and this is our time to improve our health. Grab your coffee or tea, Get comfortable and lean in. Dr. Randall Maxey, please do us the honor of moderating today's program.
Thank you very much, Janelle. And again, welcome and thanks to our distinguished speakers. And we truly do have some distinguished speakers for you today. And I also welcome my very brilliant co-moderator, Dr. Barbara Neighbor-Stevens. Last week, we looked at the statistics and we saw that on 11/22, there were 11,843,493 COVID cases in the United States. Today, I'm sorry to announce that we have 14,462,527. That includes 93,811 new cases, and over the last 7 days, a 57.6 penetration of new cases with 2,310 new deaths. We know that this pandemic is spiking in almost every county in the United States. I'm told the only one that's not spiking is a county in Hawaii. We know that many of our colleagues are positive. I got word last night that one of our committee members is COVID positive because they went to a Thanksgiving dinner and people unknowingly, uninvited, showed up. We know that all over that this disease is airborne, and we must take it very seriously, especially when communities of color are dying up to 3 times more frequent than other populations. So a word to the wise, it does make sense to wear masks. They protect both you and other people with you. We know you should be cleanly, wash hands, etc. That you should use social distancing. And you should understand that with every breath you take, you're at risk. So you need to be in a place where you're social distance. You should be outside as much as possible. And you should be with the group that you are sheltering with in your family. And even good neighbors down the street for right now should not be in close contact. I want to introduce for you my co-host, co-moderator, Dr. Barbara Neighbor-Stevens, who I met when I was a young student at Howard, and she was an even younger high school student. Dr. Neighbor-Stevens, welcome, and thank you for working with us.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And I want to thank Dr. Maxey and the Black Health Trust family for giving me the opportunity to serve in this capacity. In this capacity, I have the opportunity to learn a lot from my not former mentor and teaching fellow, still my current mentor and teaching fellow, Dr. Randall Maxey. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Maxey is a man of much depth and many interests. And every conversation that we have, I come away enriched. He is a native of Ohio, although for whatever reason, I always think of him as a true Southerner. But then I guess you could say, if you think about our history, a lot of Southern Blacks migrated to Ohio for safety. So maybe that's why I think of him as a Southerner. As he just mentioned, he was at Howard as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, first in pharmacology, which is when I met him, when I was in a high school National Science Foundation program at Howard. And then he went on to Howard Medical School. Following that, he pursued his residency in New York and subspecialty training in New York, and then found his way to the West Coast. Now, his area of specialty is nephrology, but he has used nephrology and his understanding of medicine to branch off in many different areas, not the least of which is one of the things that he's currently involved in, which is utilizing known technology in a novel way to potentially diagnose rapidly the presence of COVID. So I call him the Renaissance man because he has his finger in so many different pies. And it is not surprising that his compassion led him to the founding of Black Health Trust and the initiation of these Sunday afternoon programs. He and all of us understand that there is so much misinformation flooding the environment. We need to have some voices of truth to enlighten the community so that informed decisions can be made. So without further ado.
Let me introduce you, my dear.
Oh, okay.
Dr. Barbara Neighbor-Stephens, MD, MBA, Fellow of the American Association of Pediatrics. She's had extensive experience in the healthcare field. She did her pediatric residency for 2 years. She served in the National Health Service Corps. She's been an assistant medical director of the Tennessee Bureau of Medicaid. And she now, I say she runs an HMO in Nashville and Memphis, Tennessee. And she has been recently on the board of trustees of the National Medical Association. And she also runs the Council on Medical Legislation for the NMA. So let's introduce our first speaker, Doctor.
Our first speaker is Dr. Ewart Brown, and we are so honored to have him join us this afternoon. He has had a distinguished career. He actually is a classmate of Dr. Maxey at Howard and went on to UCLA and later became the Prime Minister in Bermuda. Since that time, he has come back to LA and been associated as a trustee of both Howard and Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science, and a professor there in the Department of Family Practice. He's been involved in leadership roles in a number of organizations, and he comes today to share with us his reflections on the impact of COVID in our community and the international community. I think I need to turn it over to Dr. Maxey again.
I went to Howard University as a young conservative doctor from Cincinnati, Ohio, and I met Ewart Brown, and he radicalized me and educated me in what it really meant to be cognizant of what was going on with our communities. He was the president of our class. He was a leader of our university. And him and our departed colleague, Dr. Henderson, actually recruited me to California. So he's been my friend. He's been my mentor. He even gave me my first honeymoon on the island of Bermuda. So I definitely welcome and honor Dr. Ewart Brown. Dr. Ewart Brown, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Randall. That's very kind of both of you. You've said such nice things about me that maybe this is where we should end it. Now, I want to really thank you. I'm honored, actually, to have been invited to share my thoughts. I don't have a particular topic other than what will happen this time. If you want to give my topic a name, that would be it. What will happen this time? And what I mean by that is that I want to go past the point of the formation and the registration, if you will, of the vaccine to what will happen now. Because remember, there was penicillin present during the Tuskegee experiment. So there was no absence of medication. There is no absence of the vaccines. And I just want to raise the issue just so that we can think about it. Is the distribution and the actual execution going to be more similar to what happened with Tuskegee, or will it reflect some more progressive thinking? Will the vaccine, if it is the vaccine that we want it to be, will it be distributed such that it will make an impact on people of color? I do believe that deserves some serious examination. And I would urge people like Dr. Nabert-Stevens and Dr. Maxey and all the people who are in positions of authority and power to make sure that there are methods by which the distribution of these vaccines, if they are in fact good vaccines, that the distribution is fair and square, and that our people will benefit from it. We all know about the disparities of healthcare delivery, and those statistics stand no matter where you go geographically. It does not matter. Good care just does not seem to get to us. And so during this time, when some people are reflecting on their own history and reflecting on a better future, maybe this is the time for us to consider ways in which the delivery system can be improved. In fact, I was reading a piece that came from London where they contend that COVID has caused them to rethink their whole system, has caused them to rethink the entire National Health Service and the preparation of students, of doctors, and the methods of delivery. So if COVID, I mean, the impact of the numbers that Dr. Maxey just revealed should be sufficient to cause anybody to think a little more deeply about what's going to happen as a result of those numbers. Will the distribution that is employed be one that can be used to distribute healthcare in general? And I know that's not 7 minutes, but that's how I'd like to start. You're still muted, Randall.
Are there any questions in the chat box? Thank you, Dr. Brown. I appreciate your remarks as usual.
No
Dr.
questions at the time.
Well, I do have a few questions. Dr. Brown, knowing not only Bermuda, but you were a major figure in Los Angeles for years and years. And we do know that we're going to come up against this decision to recommend or not recommend this vaccine to people of color. What's your take on how we should best approach that, knowing that none of us are on the central decision-making councils of the manufacturer and our distribution of this potential medication? What are your thoughts, and how would you approach it, having been the master of an entire country?
Well, I will say this. First of all, if I had the solution, you wouldn't have the problem. But this is how I'm approaching it for me. I want to see television footage of political and public health leaders receiving the vaccine with obvious proof that it is the vaccine. And then I will consider taking the vaccine.
So when they give it at the country club and the golf course, then we can look at taking it.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Nabert, some thoughts?
Yes, I thought that your comment was very appropriate and necessary, because I think many people may be under the impression that the distribution process is going to be something that is managed at the federal level. And that is not true. In fact, the federal component of this is to get the vaccine delivered to the states. But then it's going to be up to the individual states and their deadline for submitting their plan was Friday. And I don't know that all the states submitted their plan, but it's up to the states to come up with their own individual distribution plans. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because when things get down to the state level, that is where the individual citizens of that state have much more power than when things are at the federal level. And I would, first of all, urge all of our listeners to find out what your state's plan is and make sure that it is an equitable distribution plan. I am not attempting to call any one state out, but I think we all know from what we've heard in the news that all the states are not equal in terms of the way they have managed the COVID experience. Having said that, I hope this is not putting you too much on the spot, but given the problems I'm hearing here in Nashville about what's going on in California, what do you think of the California plan for managing the vaccine distribution?
Are you speaking about the financial, not the financial incentives?
Whatever it is. The reason I asked you, well, you're in California, but the reason I wanted to know about California, number one, it's so large, and number two, they have been fairly upfront about what they're doing. I mean, in their attempts to manage the pandemic, and then it kind of seems to have gotten out of control again from them. So I was wondering what you would think, what your opinion is of the state plan for the vaccine distribution.
Well, first of all, I'm not in California at the moment. I have two sons who are still there. So and a sister. So I'm very concerned. I believe that California is one of the few states where there's a large number of vocal, non-white politicians who are not afraid of speaking out on issues such as this. It is up to us as professionals, medical professionals, to remind them that this is the area where we need their help, and we need their help badly in terms of ensuring that the distribution, the delivery system is fair.
Dr. Brown, I have one more thought. There was a gentleman that became a somewhat professor amongst us for a while. His name was Neely Fuller.
Yes, sir.
Commenting from that perspective, how would he see what's going on with this pandemic and potential vaccine, and what lessons did we learn at his feet?
It's very interesting because I try to filter almost everything I do in medicine or in politics through what I call the Neely Fuller filter. And that is to say, what is the particular application to non-white people? Is there anything special about this as far as non-white people are concerned? And although I haven't spoken with Neely on this subject, I would imagine that what he would say would be something like this: find out as much information as you can. Make sure that the vaccine itself is the same vaccine all the way across the board. And there was something online the other day, and of course, there's so much material online, you don't know whether to believe it or not. But it is said that there was a container found somewhere in Asia that said to be used only in Sri Lanka and India. I don't know what that meant, but it made me wonder whether there are batches of medication, and there are batches, right, Dr. Sherrod? not all matches are the same.
Yeah. I saw a quote the other day that said, paranoia is having all of the information. That's all. Well, thank you, Dr. Brown. We certainly appreciate you spending your time with us. If you can stick around for a while and answer
Sure.
questions, we'd love to have you. Dr. Nabert, would you introduce our next speaker?
Certainly. It is my pleasure at this time to introduce Mr. Max Starks, who is joining us this afternoon as a spokesperson from the National Football League. Mr. Starks has had a distinguished career as an athlete, of course, but what caught my eye is his dedication post his athletic career to charity. And when you find somebody that is as compassionate and concerned about his fellow man as Mr. Starks's bio suggests, you know that you're in the presence of a real good person. And I can't go on enough about the number of organizations. It'd be one thing if it was just one organization, but his list of organizations goes on and on and on. Not only is he concerned about people here, he has made visits to troops stationed around the world, and he continues to do what he can with his time and his money so that as many foundations and projects can continue and do well. We here at Black Health Trust are very grateful that you've chosen to spend some time with us and see our efforts at trying to do goodwill. Mr. Starks.
Thank you, Dr. Nabret. Thank you to Dr. Maxey and Dr. Helen Davis, my aunt, for extending me the invitation. Good afternoon to everybody on the Zoom. That was very kind of you. Thank you. Not used to, still getting used to taking compliments, but in my mind, you know, when I look at what you guys are doing here and the information that you're providing, I think is paramount for our community to have the access to knowledge, because that's one of the other things that is a big discrepancy in our community, is how knowledge is disseminated, how knowledge is received. And so to see this consortium of individuals that are caring about us as a collective people is inspiring for me. You know, my family background is actually in the funeral business. I know you all are doctors and charged with life-saving aspects of it, but that's where my family history resides. And of course, when you are in that field, you care about life a lot more after you've seen the other side of it. And I wanted to come on and just kind of present my point of view as an analyst for the NFL, as an analyst for the collegiate game of football as well. I'm a broadcaster by trade now, former player for a long time. And so I have a unique perspective that I get to talk to the individuals that are going through the daily aspects of this pandemic from a sports side of it, an entertainment and leisure aspect. And one of the things that kind of disheartens me was early on with the way the NFL handled it, not having their IDER plans in place and kind of forcing players into a position where you have to do this or nothing at all. And good thing is, by being a great union that they have, they push back. But the college kids also did not, had a tough decision to make as well. As we see right now, if you're sports fans, kind of the climate of watching a college football weekend on a Saturday and all of the postponements, all the cancellations, speaks to just how deadly and how infectious this disease is. And for myself, I appreciate that they play the game because obviously my job depends on it. But more so, it's kind of the response that when you see a game, it gives you more of a lax feel for a lot of people that I encounter. And that's one of the things that kind of drove me to want to speak as far as the topic. And of course, I'm here to answer any questions. But one thing I do want to pose to this group is, have you seen any stages of, what I've called it, I'm sure there's a more technical term, but like COVID fatigue, because you see people in stadiums, people celebrating and watching sports, but also you see the athletes and how they're in close contact, not wearing masks. Does that breed some type of visual that makes people feel more comfortable or lax in what they need to do? Because from my perspective, talking to guys who go through the PCR testing daily, college players who go through it 4 times a week, I appreciate a lot of them for what they're doing, sacrificing. I mean, because let's face it, to ask an 18 to 22-year-old kid in college on a campus with other students to do the right thing is a very tough ask for them, but they've navigated those things to the best of their abilities. But for me, it is something that does concern me, is that, what are the long-term effects? We don't know. And I think for young men who are engaging in the sport, who are, and also role models essentially in the professional levels, who engage in the sport, and you see outbreaks like Tennessee, you see outbreaks like Baltimore, and the guys, quote unquote, recovering and coming back to play, but yet you don't know what the long-term effects, because when you think about how COVID attacks your body, the long-term effects are what we're starting to see. We're hearing 3-6 months, down the line, you're still seeing people who still have issues with myocarditis, heart issues, kidney issues, because it's clotting the blood, right? And there's blood that goes through your body, and those clots can cause serious adverse effects to your body. So it's something that I was posed with the question, Max, if you were still an active player, how would you proceed? And I give this advice to all of my young kids that I deal with, as well as my clients who are professional. You know your body, you know your health better than anybody else, except for your doctor. And if there is any type of pre-existing condition, especially when you're thinking about people of color, I wouldn't take that risk. It wouldn't be worth it to me, because I don't know what the long-term effects are. Everybody's like, oh, well, it's just like the flu. It's just like I'm like, no, it's not. There's a reason why it's a pandemic. The reason why you see the numbers that we see worldwide, the reason why you see the number of deaths that we see, it's a lot more deadly, a lot more infectious than how you perceive any other common disease. And we don't have an immunity for it. We don't have the natural defenses in our body. And so my kind of issue, even though I am against a lot of the guys who did make decisions to play, I understand why you do it financially, but I would have liked to have seen them in a better light accomplish this, because I think one of the biggest discrepancies we deal with as a sport, and speaking from a sports perspective, is that the NFL, for all the recommendations and comparisons against the NBA, do not have the same economic power within the sport, because there's so many more human beings that have to interact on the sport. There's 46 guys who stay active on a football field versus 13 individuals on a basketball team. And, I know we lead by example because of the large size of the sport, the large following and popularity of the sport makes for a bigger target, a bigger microscope. But the NBA has a better way of sensing those things, especially when you're thinking about social issues as well as medical issues that come along with it. You see a lot less basketball players that fall prey to more of the common diseases associated with us as African Americans than football players. My sport in general, my position in general, as an offensive lineman, I'm 6'8", 350 pounds. I get things a little bit differently, and a lot more things in my genetics versus a 5'10", 150-pound receiver. So that's one of my other concerns when we're talking about the larger players. And I work with offensive linemen specifically at O-line performance. And we talk about those things and those health factors and the risks that you have to be cognizant of moving forward. So for me, this has been a great outlet to listen, to hear, and to understand, and to have that healthy skepticism about when a vaccine comes out, how it's going to be readily available, because you have to assume that your professional sports stars are magically going to get a vaccine available to them because it relies on their ability to play the sport and entertain the masses. So that's my opening statement. If there's any questions, I'm always willing to answer. And once again, thank you, Dr. Maxey, for having me on. And thank you to the Black Health Trust for those that tuned in today.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Starks. I've got two questions, both of them very serious.
Okay.
One, I'm concerned that a number of the football teams have experienced a lot of infections recently, and in fact had to cancel games. But the first question I want to answer, how many Super Bowl rings do you have?
I currently own 2 of those. Should have had a third one, but that's up to semantics, with that opposing team. But I should have had 3, but I do have 2.
Very good. Can you talk a minute about some of the football players that, despite supposedly being isolated and in a bubble, have gotten COVID?
Yeah. So looking at, let's just take the Baltimore Ravens situation. One that the players were quote unquote in their protected area. And I won't even call it a bubble, because obviously the NBA is the one that actually successfully completed a bubble along with Major League Soccer and the NHL. Their protected space was violated by, actually not by the players, but by the strength coach. The strength coach had multiple violations for not wearing his mask, being in close proximity with players, training players in a gym where obviously we know droplets and everything else for asymptomatic people, getting on surfaces, not being cleaned properly, but also just kind of not wearing a mask. Contributed a lot to the Baltimore Ravens, and then those players being in close proximity with each other, thinking that they're safe, not wearing a mask, being lax, not following protocols in the meeting rooms. Because just like what happened in Denver last week, where the entire quarterback room was contracted the virus and was sent into quarantine, those quarterbacks weren't wearing their masks in their meeting rooms. And so to understand the different segments within a football team, the quarterback room is one of the smallest outside of the specialists, where you have 4 quarterbacks potentially that are in one space. None of them were wearing their masks. They all contract the virus. They're all sent home for quarantine and isolated. And that's why you had the issue with Denver and talking about bringing up a practice squad receiver to play quarterback because the NFL would not reschedule their game. Baltimore, the reason why their numbers were higher, I suspect, is something more so than just that strength coach's violation. I think that team-wide, they weren't following the protocols. The protocol is that when you're in an enclosed space, everybody must wear a mask the entire time. And you must also be diligent with washing your hands, with wiping down any surfaces that are high contact areas. And until you get outside and can keep space in an outdoor environment, that is where you can be a little more lax with your mouth garment. They didn't do that. And I think that's one of the things that's the toughest thing to combat, is that it will get worse, as we know with weather, as we know with holidays. Family, even though you don't want family to come, family will still show up for holidays and still be within your space. And it's for you to do the proper isolation method. Some guys have done it right. Devin McCourty for the New England Patriots, he rented a hotel room for the entire year and kept his family at home, and he Zooms them and does not see them physically because of the risk. They have young children. One of them, I believe, has an autoimmune disease. So he does not even want to risk the opportunity of the spread. I think one of the things that we'll see as we get further in this season is that you will probably see teams go into their own bubble finally. That's why I said earlier, it's not a bubble yet, but we will get to a bubble, because I think you will see what the New Orleans Saints did in preseason with going into the hotel and isolating themselves. I think you'll see that with teams that are getting ready for playoffs. You'll see them go into a hotel environment, isolate and lock down that environment to get through the playoffs, because I think there will be continual cases, there will be continual spread amongst the teams, because guys aren't going to follow directions. That's one of the things I spoke to earlier as well, is there a sense of a COVID type fatigue of people that have been doing the right thing for so long and not seeing people isolating themselves, doing everything proper, and still seeing people that interact and act more laissez-faire in public imagery that leads to a sense of relaxing themselves, like these people are enjoying life, why can't I? Even though I'm doing everything right, it's the fact you're not infected is not good enough for people at that point. And I think when you get with NFL players or you see professional athletes, those who don't often get told no, they start to get a little lax in their approach as well. So that's something that I would keep an eye on. I think that the violations, the fatigue of the protocols that are more strenuous than anybody, than what they're used to in their professional careers, has led to what we see, the lax nature of individuals wanting to take their guard down, wanting to drop their face mask or not put it on. Even though there's people that's getting tested around them, everybody still goes home. They don't go to their hotel room. They don't sit in an isolated environment. They're still exposed to the world.
We certainly appreciate your words of wisdom, and you're invited back anytime that you want. And are there any questions in the chat box for Mr. Stark?
Yeah, there's a statement and there's also a question. I'll start with the question. Would you promote the public health tools that are not experimental but backed by science? Masks, distance from others, hand washing, hygiene?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's why I'm still in the position where I'm in, because I follow those basic, simple, and what I would call rational rules that protect not only yourself, but protect others. It's having that human decency, right, for another human being. It's an inconvenience. It's not oppression, as a lot of people like to deem it as, but it's common decency. Wear your mask, wash your hands, and also keep your distance. You don't need to have a conversation 2 feet in front of a person to get your point across. And when you interact in public, understand that it can live on environments. It can live on surfaces. Don't touch your face and everything. I always see people who leave the grocery store and you would think that they had on an altitude mask for the last 15 minutes while they're going shopping. And it's like, take it off. I'm done. I'm free. I can breathe fresh air, but they're touching their face. They're not going through the protocols, removing it from the strings. You haven't used hand sanitizer. You should not be anywhere near your face region, and it's having that common decency. So I completely agree with those protocols because they've worked thus far. And we see when people don't do those, such as having a White House event where people aren't wearing masks and shaking hands and everything else, we see how that adverse effect can happen. So it's just about continually doing these things. We have progress towards a vaccine, but we do not have a vaccine yet. And I think people kind of misconstrue that with headlines that they think that, oh, we're at the light at the end of the tunnel. It's like, no, we're still in the tunnel, but it's getting brighter as we walk through it versus we're not in the sunlight yet. And I think what Dr. Brown said was very pertinent. I want to see a public display of individuals getting an actual vaccine with the name attached to it and a batch and lot number, because I want to know what that's going to be. I don't want to see you getting water injected in your veins. Oh, it's it. This is it. It's good. It's good. Look, there's liquid in there. I don't know. And like you said, I'm from the South. And so having family who are from Alabama and from Georgia who know about the Tuskegee experiments, who have told me those horror stories, I have that same type of cynicism in my mind as well, that, until you show me that it's going to be the same for everybody. And like you said, I know Arizona is getting the Moderna and the Pfizer ones. I've already looked at my wife's in healthcare, my wife's a physician, and we have nothing but physician friends in our network. So this is a conversation that's had by us a lot. is understanding what those are and then wanting to see the actual efficacy in application versus in theory and given to people who volunteered who might already be healthy. But how does it affect a senior that may have some pre-existing conditions? How does it affect a child who is young, who does not have those conditions, but you're saying it's a standardized shot that's going to help everybody? There's never been one cure-all for anything. So I think that's one of the things that I want to see as well, is that it's actually being administered publicly. There is the follow-up as well. I want to see 1 month later, you got to get that next dose. How has that person reacted to those things? Because that's a concern for all of us.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Stark. This has been wonderful. Dr. Nabrett?
Well, I am ready for you. Our next speaker is a native of Canada, did all of his initial training in Canada, and then made his way to the West Coast, where he did his specialty and subspecialty training in cardiology and interventional cardiology in the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. And he is well known in his field, but is going to talk to us today about something that we've been talking about ever since this whole series began, and that is the question of trust and trustworthiness. So without further ado, I'd like to present Dr. Weiss.
I do have a little bit of a do. Now, Dr. Weiss is special to me. He's been my physician for quite a few years as I have transitioned into being a senior citizen myself. He has one of the best qualified, largest cardiology medical groups in Los Angeles, Apex Cardiology. And he has kept me shipshape for quite a few years. And I am personally grateful that Dr. Weiss has agreed to join us today. He's somebody that I send a lot of my premier patients to. Dr. Weiss, we appreciate you.
Thank you for having me. It's going to be hard to follow that NFL talk, but I'm going to try and make it as interesting as possible. I'm going to actually talk about something not in my field, but I'm more than happy as we answer questions to answer specific questions relating to cardiovascular side effects and long-term effects of COVID-19. But I'm also have a large clinical practice of both internal medicine and cardiology. So I see a lot of patients, and the number one topic is obviously the vaccine, and will Dr. Weiss take the vaccine, and where are we at with the vaccine? And it's in keeping with that I came across this editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine, and its title was Trustworthiness Before Trust, COVID-19 Vaccine Trials in the Black Community. And what caught my eye was the opening paragraph, which sort of looked exactly like what I was seeing in my clinical practice, which is a statement that the Black people make up 13% of the US population, but they account for 21% of the deaths from COVID-19. And also that only 3% of the enrollees are African Americans in these clinical vaccine trials. So there's a low amount of participation, and that worries me as far as how much trust or how much trustworthiness is the medical profession able to garner in terms of convincing an important part of the community to participate and get the vaccine. So they went on to describe in this editorial 4 issues that came up, some of which I've never thought of before, but they're extremely relevant. And the first one, in terms of any trial, is that there be informed consent and that there be transparency in that informed consent. And I believe, based upon the two trials that are coming to a head right now, that they've kept that intact, but that it's still an issue. The second thing that they brought up was that if African Americans are going to participate in this trial or these trials, that they should also be able to reap the benefits of those trials by getting the vaccine in a fair and equitable fashion. And they raised the question based upon previous experience, such as Tuskegee and the like, that hasn't been the case with medical care in general, and in the Black community in particular. So that they brought up the fact that this should be available to everybody on an equal basis. And in terms of the African American community, since they are also more affected than the others, that maybe they should get a higher ranking in terms of when it becomes available. They thirdly talked about the whole politicization of the vaccines in general, and wanted to make sure that that wasn't held against any one group. And then last but not least, they brought up the concept that if you get a side effect from being a participant in these trials, and or if you get a side effect from taking the vaccine, what happens if you don't have insurance to take care of your side effects? What happens when you have side effects from this vaccine? Is it going to be something that's going to be covered? If you don't have insurance, how does that get covered? So they were making the argument that for vaccine-related health issues, even if you don't have insurance, that this should be something that's covered by either the companies producing the vaccine and or by the government itself, which I thought was something that I had not come across before. So they ended off this editorial by saying that we not only have to ask for trust, but we have to be worthy of that trust, not based upon prior experience, but going forward. Basically, that's what I wanted to get out from this article.
Thank you, Dr. Weiss. I certainly appreciate your perspective. I do have some comments, but first there's a housekeeping. Are there some issues with the chat box, Dr. Neighbor, we need to know about?
No, just some of the comments that were there, I wanted to make sure you were aware of.
Okay, all right. Well, Dr. Weiss, given your practice of cardiology and your perspective on vaccines, the Black Health Trust, we had our medical advisors meeting a week ago, and we have a lot of doubt. There's a lot of doubt of the doctors on our medical advisory about the safety and the fact that we don't know whether we would recommend the vaccine or not. There are those who think it is a lifesaver potentially, and there are those who think that it has a lot of ingredients that might be toxic. There are even different views on how a messenger RNA vaccine would work that could be detrimental. And we developed an outline of how we would approach this by making sure that we got the recommendations of the task force on vaccines from the National Medical Association. And then we would have our own subcommittee to review that and ask them questions, and then try to come up with a way that we could give recommendations to our community, of course, as advice that they would need to check with their own health professionals. How would you go about evaluating use of the vaccine for your own friends and family?
I have controversy in my own house in that I've told my wife many times that I'd be the first in line to get the vaccine, and she is not at all convinced that she wants to take that vaccine. even though she has underlying medical conditions that would place her at high risk. So it's even in my own house that there's this controversy. That said, I think it would go a long way towards seeing the FDA approve it first and foremost, and that it is FDA approved. It would go a long way if Dr. Fauci approved it on national TV. And it would go a long way if one of your previous speakers, I agree with, I heard that 3 former presidents are planning on going live on TV and taking it in a public forum. I think that's a fantastic way of getting everybody behind doing this. I think in my mind, it's never going to really work, the vaccine, unless there's participation. This whole thing is going to be centered around how much penetration is there going to be with the vaccine. To my knowledge, after reading a lot of these articles, I don't really think that there's much of a difference between the current vaccines. I think they're all equally effective and equally safe from what I've read. But I think that convincing people to take it is going to be the biggest hardship that we're going to go through. I mean, I can tell you right now, in my clinical practice, I have more trouble convincing a patient to get a flu shot than if I told them, you know, you really need open heart surgery. We need to crack your chest open and put 5 bypasses. The patient will say, where do I show up tomorrow, doc? But if I tell them you need a flu shot, they look at me, oh my God, how could you even say that? You know, so it's a controversy, and that's magnified tenfold by the whole COVID issue. So it's going to be a difficult decision for everybody to make and participate. But I think the country needs this to happen and as quickly as possible in the safest fashion as possible.
As I look in the chat box for other questions, I want to bring up a patient that we share who's an 89-year-old man who happens to be a pastor, who I see almost every week because of chest pain, shortness of breath, severe anxiety, and there was something described as a broken heart syndrome. And every time he comes, I make sure I get his enzymes, I get his EKG, because I'm so afraid he could be telling the truth for once. But can you describe some of your patients that have had what sounds like COVID or cardiac problems? And this one gentleman who's normally very credible, but I'm extremely worried about him and don't know quite what else to do for him.
I think that the commonest thing that I'm seeing clinically is that patients who are otherwise healthy, who get ill, and sometimes the description of the illness is very limited, but the number one thing that always catches my attention right off the top is any description of shortness of breath spontaneously by the patient without me even asking. And if I know that patient, and I think this is where being a doctor and taking care of people and not being just a computer is important. If you know the patient and they've never complained of shortness of breath, and you put the oximeter, which anybody could buy for $20 on them, and see that their O2 sat is 85, that's a good indication that irregardless of what you think, they're COVID until proven otherwise. And a lot of times I've seen where patients come in and don't even think they have COVID, but they actually do have COVID. So it's far more ubiquitous than even people realize, even in our office, which we've, knock wood, been able to aggressively not have a single case that we're aware of in our employee population and or in our patient population, but it's been a lot of work to try and keep that up, and getting COVID fatigue is seeping in at all the cracks, and we're trying to prevent that. But we're still open for business and seeing quite a few patients, trying to maintain as strict code as we can in doing it. And we think we're doing a good service for the community.
Okay. Are there any questions in the chat box, Dr. Neighbor, or any other questions?
Well, I wanted to ask Dr. Weiss, what is the, things change every week as new information is discovered and learned. What is the current thought around what predisposition needs to be in place for the long-term effects of COVID on the heart, and what can be done to perhaps prevent the development of specifically the cardiac long-term effects of COVID?
Not proven yet, but very much in keeping with what you're asking, is how early should patients who get admitted for COVID-related symptoms, in other words, typically shortness of breath, bad enough to require hospitalization, that implies that they're having already some inflammation of their lungs related to COVID-19, and whether or not how early they should get steroids, number one, because they've been shown to be beneficial for preventing the reaction or the attack on the vascular system that COVID has, and how quickly also should they be on anticoagulant therapy in the form of various different oral medications to prevent blood clots from forming inside the arteries to the heart or the lungs or the legs. And I think we're seeing, even though it's not been published and accepted, that the earlier you give these, the better. So a lot of patients are getting steroids high dose early in their admission. A lot of patients are being placed on anticoagulant therapy early on. And I'm seeing a lot less because of that, the kinds of things that we saw early on in terms of blood clots in the legs and the lungs and the arteries to the heart than what we were seeing early on. We're still seeing a lot of these so-called myocarditis leaks, blood test abnormalities, but the big damage issues that we saw early on, I definitely think of lessened since we've been more aggressive with steroids and with anticoagulation.
And as a follow-up, have you seen that I'm a pediatrician by training, and we're certainly concerned that especially the young athletes, but all of the young people who get COVID are spared the long-term effects. Are you seeing any decrease in the incidence of the myocarditis in the younger crew?
No, I can't say that. I've seen typically in the younger group, the same type of pattern hasn't really changed. And whether or not that's going to have long-term consequences is a huge issue. And especially for the athletes as well. It's kind of, it's one thing to say if you're an NFL player getting paid and participating and you get COVID. It's another thing if you're not getting paid and a student at a university who's making money off of that game, but you're not protected short-term or long-term. I'm not sure there's a lot of issues that gets raised in my mind in that patient population, especially that they're young and they have a lot of years to go and they haven't even made their first dollar as a professional.
So my last question is, as you know, the first of the 2 FDA hearings will kick off this week. If you were in the room and allowed to ask a question, what question would you ask of the manufacturer?
Basically, their side effect issues and whether or not how well they've documented it. What are the cases that we've heard in the press that haven't really been told yet about some severe reactions? What are those severe reactions, and what kind of patient was that? So the minor reactions are one thing, and Dr. Fauci says that 95% of all side effects related to the vaccines will appear within the first 2 months. So I just want to hear on the ones that did have side effects, how extensive were those people worked up? Because I think that's going to be an important thing, because you have to multiply that by now millions and think of what other side effects could that lead to, and we don't know.
Are there any questions in the chat box?
No, I don't think so. Not for Dr. Weiss specifically, but Dr. Weiss, I hope that you can stay so that when we have our final round of questions, you'll be able to respond.
Happy to.
Thank you.
There's a couple of comments. One, Dr. Weiss is the only doctor I know with a CAT scanner in his office. That was amazing and mind blowing. Also, I just heard over the internet that we have another person tested positive named Rudy Giuliani. I don't know what.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Let's introduce Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks is the past president of the Executive Leadership Council, a group of 500 of the most senior African-American Fortune 500 executives. And they run a lot of the major companies, including Big Pharma and Merrill Lynch and American Express. And he has sat on top of that group for a number of years. And he serves as the chairman of our Administrative Advisory Committee, Mr. Carl Brooks.
Good afternoon. I was sitting back listening to these fabulous presentations and thinking about all the things that we have to be thankful for. And having access to this fabulous group of doctors, other business medical professionals is an asset. And we're listening to the best and brightest. We're getting this information on a consistent basis. And we need to take a moment and just think about what we're getting and what we're receiving. These conversations don't happen anywhere else. And they're happening in a very open way, and it's been happening since June. So one of the things I'm most thankful for is having access to this kind of information. I've talked to you over the last several months about two different issues that we needed your help on. The first was getting out and voting like your life depended on it, because it did, and it still does. And there's still two votes or two elections that need to take place in the state of Georgia, and therefore senatorial positions. We need to go out and support those candidates in an aggressive way and ensure that when the president and the new president comes in place, that a Senate will be responsive and a House will be responsive, so we can get the right bills passed to get some economics and some monies back into people's hands. The second thing that we've talked about is fundraising and how we support ourselves. And Randall was right when he talked about the Executive Leadership Council, the most, the baddest brothers and sisters on the planet. What we used to talk about is how we help ourselves. It's one thing to have big budgets and to be able to use support from your corporations, but then there was a personal contribution that needed to be made by those members to make sure the organization grew. And the organization continues to grow as we speak. We need to do the same thing for self. As we sit in front of the various grant providers and the various corporations that have indicated interest in us, the first thing they're going to ask is, what is your budget? And what are you doing to provide monies to your own budget? What are you doing? What kind of support are you getting? And we need to be able to answer that in a very positive way. I've looked at the most recent listings of the givers and donators, and some friends and guests of mine are well on that list and doing well and continue to do that. Beyond my list is the total list of everybody, the 7,000 to 10,000 people on this call. We need your help and we need your cash contributions. We're going to do right by your contributions. We're going to be able to take this program on a continuing basis and make sure it continues to impact in a positive way our communities. We're begging for help. Randall and I will sit in front of the grant providers in a couple of days, and we need to be able to say that we've done the right things for ourselves and we still need your help. So please look at blackhealthtrust.org and hit the donate button, which is on the right-hand side, and contribute to this fabulous organization. Thank you, and take care of yourself and stay healthy.
Thank you so much, Mr. Brooks. I appreciate you. We met with our attorneys, and we want to make sure that we give every few moments the fact that we are not giving direct medical advice, even though we're physicians. We're licensed in a number of states. but it's important that we put the information out here. But we must say that we're giving you advice, but not direct medical advice. You are expected to go to your own physician, your own health professional to get advice pertinent directly to you. These doctors are giving of their time and of their study, and we certainly appreciate it, but every individual is an individual person, and you need to speak with a health professional that knows you and your situation. I'm going to ask Dr. Barbara Nabret to introduce our next speaker, but I'm going to lead in and call him an MVP. Mr. Starks, I know that's usually a baseball team, but maybe there's a football team that has an MVP. But Dr. Morrow Salafu has been an MVP with the Black Health Trust. He is a brilliant, and I'm going to call him young clinician and chief of the Department of Medicine at SUNY Downstate. But Dr. Barbara, would you give him his propers and his introduction, Dr. Salafu?
It would be my pleasure. Dr. Salafu has been with us before and shared a wonderful explanation on how COVID virus can interact with the kidney and create problems. He is one of these, brilliant doctors who didn't settle for just one fellowship, but actually did 3 and is certified in 3 subspecialties, all related to management of kidney disease. He was brought in at SUNY to help transform their transplant program, which he did with great success, and has moved the transplant and kidney and kidney dialysis programs at Downstate to new heights and glories. He has been recognized for his research and achievements there at SUNY and received many grants. He has also published extensively. We are very fortunate to have someone of his caliber to be a part of our family now, because kidney disease is a disease that disproportionately affects our community. And today he's going to talk with us some more about how we can perhaps impact the prevalence of kidney disease and long-term effects of kidney disease by modifying our behaviors based on information. But Dr. Salafu, I'm going to give you a heads up. The last question that I asked Dr. Weiss, I'm also going to ask you, so you might want to be thinking about what question you want to put to the FDA panel if you had the opportunity to be in the room this week. Without further ado, Dr. Salafu.
I appreciate this wonderful introduction, so thank you very much. I would like to answer the question first. If I were in the room, what would I say to the companies? My question has to do with the type of vaccination that we have. It's an RNA vaccine, so the antibody is really not against the RNA. It's against the protein encoded by the RNA. So what happens to the actual RNA? What happens to it? Is it going to be there permanently, or is it going to disappear at some point? So you get the RNA gets integrated into your DNA and then encodes for the protein that then gets incorporated into your cell wall, that is then recognized by your immune system. And that is how your immune system then responds to the protein and then against the virus. But what happens to the RNA? Nobody has answered that question yet. And if the RNA doesn't go away, what happens to the RNA in that DNA integration long term? Nobody has answered that question yet. So that is where my problem is in terms of the vaccine. So I hope you can carry it along those lines and then try to figure out what other questions you may ask. Anyway, so today, may I have sharing privileges for my slides? May I have sharing privileges for my slides so that I can share some slides? Okay, good.
Did you pay your 25 cents?
I have it here now, so this is good. This is good. All right, so let's. Can you see my slides? Okay, very good. How about my sound? The voice is okay?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Anyway, so the topic today was on the COVID-19 epidemic and the effects of COVID-19 on the kidney, but the speaker was not able to make it, so I'm a substitute presenter this afternoon, but it's still in the area of kidney. So I wanted to talk about resistant hypertension because resistant hypertension is a big problem for everybody, especially in Black people. And, you know, if you look at the prevalence of hypertension, hypertension is 16 times more prevalent in Black people compared to other races. That is a major problem. And that is what was distinguishing in terms of the comorbidities for COVID infection. So I wanted to take some time and then try to explain what that meant, why is the prevalence so high in our community, why we are unable to control it, so that people are more aware of this category of hypertension and then become more familiar with how to interact with their doctors and get the necessary care that they are supposed to get. Okay, so I will start by this study. This was one of the largest study in hypertension. It's called a SPRINT trial, systolic blood pressure intervention trial. This was one of the largest blood pressure trials in history. Of course, there were many other blood pressure trials, and the cutoff for blood pressure, in those before 2017 was 140 over 90 millimeters of mercury. But that was only arbitrary. It was all, the numbers were chosen because as your blood pressure goes up, there's a certain cut point where the mortality goes up. So the 140 over 90, that was previously used as the cutoff for hypertension diagnosis, was not really scientifically based. It was just convenient. It was probably, around that number, but it wasn't exactly the number that people were hoping to get. So the only study that has been able to address that number specifically is this study. This study started somewhere in 2011, 2012, and concluded around 2017 when the results were published. So I don't really want to go to all the old studies and then try to confuse people. I just want to go straight to this study and then describe what it did. So 8,000 people were randomized to what we call normal, which is 120. Everybody knows. The common, the lay person on the street, they all understand that when you say normal blood pressure, everyone understands that 120 is sort of where we think is normal, right? So that one, I don't think there's so much argument around that number of normal. So 120 we will say as normal. The 140 is where the problem was. People were not sure whether the 140 was a real number or not. So this study was looking at whether if you randomize two groups of people to 120 normal and compare them to randomizing people to achieving the 140 goal, you could make a difference in survival, okay? And in short, these are the number of deaths in the 140 group, and then these are the number of deaths in the intensive group. So that was significant. So the number of people who were dying, if they remained at the 140 of blood pressure, was much, much higher than those people who had intensive blood pressure control, the 120 millimeters of mercury. So this changed the entire landscape. We used to have, groups called the National Joint Commission on Hypertension, JNC1, JNC2, all these, the committees met every 7 to 8 years to, review the literature and come up with, different, recommendations for blood pressure control. This just destroyed the entire landscape. As a matter of fact, the Joint National Committee on Hypertension has been disbanded. We no longer have it any longer. So now the various professional groups are now making their own recommendations. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit, okay? But this is the one that changed the landscape, and I want everyone to understand that. So if you look at the subgroup analysis, looking at, okay, so, it did make a difference. What about, did it make a difference in African Americans and Black people in general? And I want to focus your attention to the numbers here, the African American numbers. This is intensive, and these are the standard group. Intensive means your blood pressure was 120 over 80, and then the standard was 140 over 90. And it was almost approaching significance. I mean, 0.06 is almost like 0.05. I think it's a numbers issue because they couldn't recruit enough African Americans. Like, in the vaccine trials, we had the same problem. 3% of African Americans or Black people, participating in vaccine trials a shame to everybody. It's really a big shame because we've been talking about, African Americans and Black people in general, participating in clinical trials. There is really no problem with, us, taking part in clinical trials, yet the studies are not coming to us to be able to participate and provide the data. So I think this was only an issue of numbers, but they did conclude that there was no significant difference between the standard and intensive treatment goals in African American patients. This is, I believe, just numbers, but the intensive blood pressure control did benefit everybody, and it was almost approaching significance in African American patients. So what did the committee do? They changed the entire blood pressure classification. So normal blood pressure is now 120 over 80, which was disputed, right? Now, this is what is now new. Elevated blood pressure is now 120 to 129. This used to be called prehypertension in the old classification, and nobody should be bothered about the old classification, but the new is elevated, and you have to do lifestyle modification to control that. So now the new hypertension diagnosis is 130 to 139 systolic blood pressure, or 80 to 89. That is the new classification. Now, this is serious business because when the recommendations came in November of 2017, it moved the diagnosis from 140 to 130 as the diagnosis of hypertension, and immediately 46 million people in the United States had hypertension, just based on the number. That's a huge change, right? We just do one study, we change the numbers from 140 to 130, and immediately 46 million people have hypertension in the United States. So that's huge. But that's what we got. And stage 1, stage 2 is now more than 140, which used to be stage 1 hypertension in general. Now, if we want to actually understand whether these numbers are correct, we have to also determine whether this is, really properly measured or not. So we have terminology like white coat hypertension. This is blood pressure, which is high in the doctor's office, but it's normal at home. People are usually scared when they get to the doctor's office. So that is something that people have to keep in mind, and we have ways to deal with that. And there's another category called masked hypertension. This is blood pressure that is normal. It's the opposite of white coat hypertension. It's blood pressure that is normal in the doctor's office, but it's actually high at home. Either way, we have to find a way to be able to reliably measure blood pressure. So how do we do that? We have to do that by home blood pressure monitoring. Actually, it's very good. So in my office, I don't use the office blood pressure. All my patients come to me with 3 days of blood pressure measurement from home. That's what I do. I make sure everybody understands, they check their blood pressure, they keep the numbers, they get the rates, the log, they bring the log to the clinic, and I use the log to determine whether the blood pressure within go or not go. But the gold standard is actually the ambulatory blood pressure. That is really the gold standard, but that is more difficult to do and more difficult to achieve. So in today's world, if you are telling somebody, how do you actually get good blood pressure measurement? The answer is home blood pressure. It's not to come and sit in the doctor's office and get the stuff in your arm and measure the blood pressure. That is not what is accurate. What is accurate and reliable is your blood pressure at home. And I think the audience should be able to, should know that. Okay, the next thing is talking about the prevalence now between men and women. And I want you to focus on the colors here. This is the non-Hispanic white and the non-Hispanic blacks. This is basically, our population here. So it is very high, 57%, almost 60% of us have high blood pressure. That is what is also driving the COVID numbers. It's a serious comorbidity because it always leads to so many things. It leads to kidney problems, heart problems, strokes, peripheral vascular disease, and overall cardiovascular burden. So it's a major, major problem. And 60% of a population having a disease is serious business. And yet we don't spend too much time talking about that. So I really want to highlight this point. Now, this is a busy slide, but don't worry, I will make it simple. This is the awareness. So the awareness part of hypertension is not our problem, okay? These colors here mean awareness. Awareness is in the range of 70 to 80%. So most people are aware of hypertension, so that's not a problem. The treatment is much lower. Treatment is around 46 to 60% averagely. So more people are aware, less people are treated, and let's look at the goal, the control, and even less people are treated to go, right? Only an average of 30% of the patients with high blood pressure would actually achieve the target blood pressure. That is serious business. That is seriously killing everybody, right? A lot of the people with hypertension. Now, if you focus on the African-American numbers, this is the blue, you see that 30% of our population actually get to the goal blood pressure, which is also not very good. It's nowhere close to where we're supposed to be. So the definition of resistant hypertension is your blood pressure remaining above goal in spite of using multiple drugs. Usually it's 3 or more drugs. Ideally, one of them should be a diuretic, but that is questionable. But the use of 3 or more blood pressure medication not being able to achieve the blood pressure is what we classically define as resistant. So what is causing that? We should know that. Some of them are things that we can do. Some of them are studies that we can do to reveal them so that we can address them and then actually bring it down so that the control rate will go up. 30% of patients with hypertension being controlled is really, really a shame on our community. I don't think we can blame the patient, but there is something that is wrong in the way we approach the disease. That is why we're not achieving the goals. All right, so let's look at patient characteristics. All right, of course, the older you are, the more you have stiff vessels, so it's more difficult to control. Obesity is the problem. If you eat a lot of salt, it's a problem. Kidney disease, kidney is the one that removes the salt and the water, allows you to go into balance. So if you have, if you have additional kidney problems, then it makes the blood pressure control more difficult. Diabetes is a problem because diabetes tends to make you to retain salt and water. That makes the blood pressure control more difficult. If you have heart problems, it makes it more difficult. African-American race, there is a more genetic reason for this. Some of them have explained in terms of salt sensitivity. We are more salt sensitive. We're unable to excrete salt more efficient than other races. So the retention of salt and water allows the blood pressure to go up. Female gender, and then residents in southeastern United States also is a risk factor for hypertension. I don't know whether this is because of salt intake or not, but that is also classified. There are some lifestyle factors. These are obesity and overweight, high salt diet, physical inactivity, ingestion of low fiber and high fat diets is also a culprit, and heavy alcohol ingestion. These are all modifiable risk factors. These are very modifiable. Now, the patient comes to the clinic or sees a doctor, we just prescribe and then you go, but we don't address these issues. These issues must be part of addressing the blood pressure so that we can get the blood pressure under control. Right? There are some of the issues that need to be addressed. Like I mentioned before, if the patient has white coat hypertension, you can pick that up, but you should be able to then tell the patient to bring their home blood pressure measurement so that you can actually see whether the blood pressure measurement is accurate or not. Okay, and then of course this is a patient-related factor, but for the most part, it's because we haven't chosen the right medication, because patients are very concerned about side effects, and if you don't have very good conversation with the patient to determine what side effects they are facing and try to prescribe newer agent that reduce those side effects, you would be encountering a lot of non-adherence to medication. But it's not because of the patient's fault. It's because you did not ask, what is your side effect? And can I give you something else that would control your blood pressure? And that is why the patient is non-adherent. Other things that can cause the blood pressure to get out of control: NSAIDs, that is the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like Motrin, Aleve, and Advil, and the like kinds of medications. The COX-2 inhibitors also cause fluid retention. All these drugs cause fluid retention and salt retention, and therefore can cause hypertension. Then you have the sympathomimetic agents like things that we use for the nasal decongestants, diet pills, and cocaine abuse. These are things that actually stimulate the sympathetic nervous system and then can also lead to salt and water retention, and therefore lead to uncontrolled high blood pressure. Then stimulants like methylphenidate, amphetamines, all this stuff also cause that. And then things that we can actually control: alcohol use, the contraceptives, cyclosporin, erythropoietin drugs. The natural licorice actually causes high blood pressure because it allows you to resorb to actually retain a lot of salt and water from the kidney, and some herbs can also do the same thing. So it's a comprehensive approach to making sure that you actually get these patients to understand the various factors, and you try to eliminate as many factors as possible so the patient can respond very well. So the next thing is, how do you then screen? Generally, we screen for secondary hypertension, make sure there's nothing else going on. If the person is, developing high blood pressure at the age less than 30, it's a problem. You know that there is something really going on that is not the regular essential hypertension. or if the hypertension is developing after the age of 50, you know that there is something that is possible. It's not the routine essential hypertension. And of course, the number of medication used to treat the patient. And then if you have specific laboratory abnormalities, these are now the doctor issues. There's a condition called low potassium. If the patient is coming to the clinic with low potassium, it means that the patient may be having episodic flushing and palpitations. It means that the patient could be developing hypertension. That is secondary. That is, there is a real reason why they have hypertension, not the essential hypertension. So these are the causes for the secondary hypertension. These ones are real reasons, but they account for only maybe 3 to 4% of the overall hypertension. So what we have in general is 95%. We classify that under essential. The secondary causes are specific causes. They can actually be treated. So kidney disease is one of them. Then the blood vessels supplying the blood to the kidneys is one of them. Sometimes they get narrowed, like you have narrowing in the heart, so very, very similar. And that causes kidney damage and hypertension. Sometimes the adrenal gland has problems in it that is producing so much hormone that the hormones then lead to salt and water retention, and that is a specific cause. I'm going to highlight this, sleep disorders. A lot of us don't sleep. If you don't sleep, you are going to develop hypertension, all right? The stress level associated with lack of sleep is a problem in our community, and we don't talk much about them. So I'm going to highlight that in a little bit in one slide. Then there are other conditions that are more uncommon, like pheochromocytoma. These are more uncommon diseases, and hyper or hypoparathyroidism. Now, these ones, I see a lot of patients come to my clinic referred because the patient couldn't be treated. And then when I see the patient the first time, I know that it's one of these conditions, boom, done, and then the patient's treated. So I just want our audience to understand that there is a phenomenon of secondary hypertension, and that if your blood pressure is not well controlled, the doctor should be looking for secondary causes for the blood pressure, especially if the blood pressure is less than 30, you are less than 30 years of age, or you are more than 50 years of age. I'm going to highlight these sleep disorders because sleep disorders is very, very common in the community. 30 to 80% of patients with hypertension also have sleep disorders. And sleep disorders means what? You have daytime somnolence, you have headaches, you have snoring, or somebody's witnessing some apneic episodes. And it's so easy to diagnose. We diagnose it by doing sleep studies, and you can treat very effectively. You can treat the sleep disorder very effectively with weight loss, CPAP, or surgical methods. So it is very common, it's treatable, and can lead to very nice reductions in blood pressure. This is a study looking at how much can you gain by prescribing CPAP. You can see that you can bring the blood pressure down from 142 to 134 just by treating the patient with CPAP. So this patient doesn't really need medications. Just treat the sleep apnea and the blood pressure comes down, right? And then it doesn't work when you don't have hypertension, but if you have hypertension, it does work reasonably well. So I wanted to highlight the sleep disorder because it's a common thing and it's something that we can do something about. So what are the consequences of resistant hypertension? So those are my last few slides. Okay, kidney disease itself. I said hypertension is 16 times more in blacks. That is serious. Now, kidney disease is 4 times more in blacks than in other population. And it's all driven by hypertension. So that is a 2-factor combination that is really serious. And that's why we're seeing a high prevalence of patients with hypertension and kidney disease. There is a specific gene, and the audience here would be surprised if not. I'm sure some of them will be surprised to hear it for the first time. It's called the ApoL1 risk mutation, right? The ApoL1 is like sickle, just an analogy. It's like sickle cell disease. There's a mutation that causes sickle cell, but the mutation also prevents you from getting malaria. And that was the mutation in West Africa because there was so much malaria. There was now this genetic mutation that allowed the sickle cell to actually be resistant to malaria, which is a good thing for the population, but not a good thing for the person, right? Same thing for ApoL1. The trypanosomiasis, that is the disease that causes sleeping sickness, has this ApoL1. The people who live in these regions, in West Africa and East Africa, they have a mutation that allows them to be resistant to the sleeping sickness. And that is the ApoL1 risk mutation. But then the resistance to the sleeping sickness actually predisposes them to hypertension. And that gene has been traced to Europe and to America, and it doesn't exist in white people, it exists just only in Black people, right? And 13%, and then several analyses were done in the United States, and they saw that 13% of Blacks in the United States have 2 risk alleles. And when you have 2 risk alleles, it means that you are going to develop hypertension or some other problem that is related to kidney disease. So that is where we are with the prevalence of hypertension and risk in African Americans. This APOL1 now combined with essential hypertension, now we know why there's so much risk involved because of this gene abnormality. Now, should we go testing for APOL1? The answer is probably not, but should we be more aggressive in treating blood pressure because the APOL1 makes the hypertension progress to kidney disease faster? The answer is yes, so we have to be very aggressive in managing the hypertension. Of course, other conditions with stroke, heart failure, and heart disease and peripheral vascular disease are all consequences of severe and resistant hypertension. So we have to really take this very seriously and then get our doctors, really, the doctor has to, the patient has to know and then hold the doctor responsible for making sure the blood pressure is under control. Okay, so in summary, any new onset blood pressure that is less than, in a patient who is less than 30 years old or more than 50 years old, you have to suspect that there is something else going on, right? And especially if you're using 3 or more medications and the blood pressure is not getting under control, as we define it, it is even more of a serious problem. If you have the patient with low potassium and the patient is presenting with other symptoms, as I explained here, that is even more of a problem. So in conclusion, blood pressure that is difficult to control must trigger, searching for additional causes. And the goal is to treat the target. The target right now is 130. The target is no longer 140, all right? The target is 130. The target is no longer 140. Oh, that is the systolic blood pressure. And then we should always remember the sleep disorder because it's something that is simple, that is treatable, and is very, very prevalent. So I will stop here and take some questions.
Dr. Salafou, thank you for your very astute lecture. And I've decided that I want to come back and repeat my fellowship under you. I just want to get used to cold weather again.
No worries about that. Mm-hmm.
Very good. I have a question as they look in the chat box for other questions. That's in terms of medication choice. I'd like to hear your choice of medications and how you arrive at that for people of African descent. And I'm speaking specifically of those medications that you believe would help counter progressive CKD because of hypertension.
Okay, so that's a very good question. So what are your choices? If the diagnosis of hypertension is made, what are the choices? So based on studies, and the biggest one is All Heart. It's publicly available. You can type it on Google, ALLHAT, All Heart study. The first choice really should be a diuretic. It actually works. A water pill actually works. And then African Americans, a calcium channel blocker will be the next choice. So if the diuretic doesn't put the blood pressure under control, then the addition of calcium channel blocker would actually help a lot. And that's also based on evidence. And then there is the third choice, which may or may not be at the same level of the calcium channel blockade. Those are the angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors. Those have specific indications. For the treatment of high blood pressure itself, it is not a second choice. But for the treatment of specific indications, it's the first choice. So what do I mean by that? If you have heart disease, you have already established kidney disease, you have protein in your urine, those 3 abnormalities, if you have them, then, or you have heart failure, then you have specific, we call them compelling indication to actually initiate your ACE inhibitors. But in the absence of those compelling indications, just for the management of high blood pressure, really your choice first will be diuretic, a calcium channel blockers, and I'm saying this specific for African Americans or Black, and then you add your ACE inhibitor if you cannot get under control. Those are your 3. And then anything you add else is because you couldn't get the blood pressure under control with those 3 agents. Now, should you maximize one before you go to the other? No, because smaller doses of multiple medications are more likely to give you less side effects than maximizing each of the doses.
Well, thank you. Are there some questions in the chat box for Dr. Salafou?
Yeah, we have a couple questions here. One question we have is, How does the blood pressure of African Americans compare to Black people in other countries with large Black populations, specifically the Caribbean and countries in Africa, like Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa? How much of the difference, if any, can be the result of living under constant racial stress, covert and overt, and or diet and or genetics, specifically epigenetic?
Wow, that's a very difficult question to answer, but I can tell you my own experience. I did a study looking at the Caribbean diaspora in the United States. I took a cohort of patients and I followed over, I believe it was 800 people. I found them in the barber shops and salons. I had a very huge community-based project. And we wanted people who have arrived from the Caribbean to the United States for maximum 6 months with normal blood pressure. And we would follow them over years to see what happens to them. Beautiful study. So we did that. We were able to identify about 600 people who came from, Haiti, Jamaica, Trinidad, and so on and so forth. They all had normal blood pressure at the time they got to the United States within 1 month. They all had some reason to measure their blood pressure, had normal blood pressure. And we followed them over 3 years. Now, the result we found was that 34% of them developed high blood pressure within the 3 years of follow-up. That is serious business. So now we have to explain why, such a rapid, development of high blood pressure in such a very short time. We are still in the process of writing the paper up, but my hypothesis is that the stress load is very high. People come, they have to work 2 jobs, they have to settle their immigration issues. There's just so much going on in their life. And I have a simple word for it. It's called the allostatic load. The allostatic load of these patients is so high that it's very difficult to control without solving those basic social determinants of health issues. And that is probably why we found what we found. But I don't have anything serious in the literature to be able to tell you the blood pressure is a little bit higher or lower between the various countries.
Excellent. Any other questions in the chat box?
Yeah, somebody wanted to know, what is the maximum recommended daily sodium intake for a patient with kidney issues and congestive heart failure?
Okay, so in terms of grams, it's about 2 grams or less. 2 grams or less would be like maybe a teaspoon. 1 teaspoon is 2 grams. So if you put salt in a teaspoon, it's 2 grams. That is it. You can't eat more than that in a day, right? So that is what's recommended. Now, how do you measure that? It's very difficult. Basically, all the processed foods have sodium. So you can actually look at the can and you can determine how much sodium they have in the cans of food. We want the total milli equivalent to be around 150, 200 milli equivalents, because the can doesn't tell you the grams, it tells you the milli equivalents. So if you add up all the milli equivalents in can A, can B, it all adds up to 150, you are good. The 150 takes you to 2 grams. Anything beyond that is probably going to be 3 or 4 grams.
Very good. Any other things in the chat box for Dr. Salifu?
What are recommendations for timing of the blood pressure measurement?
So if you're in the office, the recommendation is to sit for 5 minutes, relaxed, right? Relaxed. And then your arm should be at the level of your heart at the time that the blood pressure is being measured. So you have to sit for at least 5 minutes. The blood pressure is measured with your arm at the level of your of your heart. And then the first blood pressure measurement is taken. Then the second measurement should be within 2 minutes of the first measurement, and you take the average of the 2. That is the way to do it, but most people don't do it that way. But that is the recommended way to do the blood pressure. 5 minutes sitting, you take the blood pressure with your arm at your heart level, you wait for 2 minutes, take a second measurement, you take the average, and that is the blood pressure.
Excellent. I want to start something. What is the difference, or is there a difference in the way that a cardiologist and a nephrologist treat high blood pressure? I'm going to throw that first to Dr. Weiss and then Dr. Salifu. Why not have a little controversy?
I can start by saying that the cardiologists want to own hypertension and then nephrology wants to own it. So, but I think that we have to be coordinating the care in terms of hypertension, because hypertension knocks the kidney, knocks the heart, so It depends on the local expertise. So in our hospital, nephrology owns hypertension. I know in other hospitals, actually endocrinology also owns hypertension because part of their field. But in our hospital, for instance, the hypertension management is within nephrology. But it doesn't really matter as long as you dedicate resources to it. That's my opinion. And what are the resources? There are so much resource that needs to be dedicated to actually identifying secondary causes of hypertension. And if you don't dedicate those resources, you cannot reasonably manage hypertension effectively. So those resources usually is what separates the teams. The teams that are able to, let's say, for instance, you have a team doing 24-hour blood pressure monitoring, ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. That is something that you have to invest in. It's not like you say it and it happens. You actually have to buy the machines. You have to have somebody, the referral system to get that done. You have to have the people who actually hook up the machines to bring the results and report the results. And then you have a team of people who can do all the studies to pick up the secondary hypertension. And then you have meetings and to make sure that people are getting treated with surgery and other means of treatment. So it depends on how the group is willing to put resources to manage all the various aspects of hypertension. That is the way I see it. Dr. Weiss?
Dr. Weiss, you on? Then let me ask you more. Dr. Weiss,
Yeah, I'm here.
go ahead.
It is a little bit of a turf war, I agree, but I think it's not really a war. I think we're all participating in it. I thought your discussion, first of all, was excellent, and I really have no qualms about the order with which you recommended medications and how to introduce them. All I would add to what you did, what you mentioned, but we have a problem almost on a daily basis in my office, is that blood pressure is poorly controlled in general. And patients are very resistant to augmenting their medications, holding them to the 130/80 number. They always look at me like I'm off my rocker for getting upset if they're 150/90. That should be more than good enough. The other doctor said it was fine. So why are you having such a problem with it? And that's because it's not out there in the general population community about how important it is to get the blood pressure down, and that consistency being elevated is a problem, which is undertreated by many physicians, unfortunately. So in general, I agree with the introduction of, especially in African Americans, of a diuretic / calcium blocker. I try not to use an ACE inhibitor first up, because I find that there is, especially in the African American population, a higher incidence of allergic reactions to it than in the general population. So I don't go to that as my first order drug, specifically in African Americans. But my community, Randall's community, is fraught with hypertension like you'll never see anywhere else. I think somebody told me that Inglewood, California, and Newark, New Jersey have the highest hypertension and the highest dialysis per capita in the country. So we have a lot of experience treating high blood pressure in our community.
Well, let me ask a user-friendly question of both of you, and also Dr. Brown, if he's still on, Dr. Starks, Mr. Starks, who, being an athlete, is a nutritionist as well. But we've talked about making sure that in your eating habits, if you have a lot of antioxidants, that you take micronutrients, and we are concerned with the endothelium, which is one of the factors in high blood pressure. How can we boil this down to tell our people how to eat more correctly, both not only for high blood pressure, heart disease, and COVID, but as a cardiologist and a nephrologist and a family practitioner and an NFL player for the Pittsburgh Steelers? I had to get that in. How would you see us having a unifying message of how diet, nutrition, and lifestyle affects all of those issues?
Wow. Well, the one that I would like to quote is the DASH. There's a study called the DASH, DASH. It's also publicly available online, the DASH diet. They had a subgroup analysis of the DASH diet, which is basically a diet rich in fruits and vegetables and high in fiber, and low in fat. That is the diet, DASH diet. They had a subgroup analysis of the DASH diet, and they found out that it was very effective in African American populations. So that is the reference that I would like to give, and people can read it and then see what that means. But it's quite effective. If you look at the genetic aspects, which is, I can come another time and talk about the genetic aspects of hypertension, which is very interesting. There is a very high degree of salt retention in our population. So if you keep adding salt to the bag, you can only expand the volume, because it's a constant, it's a container. You have water and salt. So the more you add salt, you can increase the concentration or you can increase the volume. So if you increase the salt content, your blood pressure always goes up. So I think that is, the diet is really very important, supported by the evidence that I just mentioned, and other smaller studies as well.
Dr. Brown, are you still on?
Dr. White.
Dr. Weiss?
The only thing I would add to it, that in terms of just a diet in general, what I find very helpful in my practice is if there's an issue with somebody being overweight or their blood pressure being affected because they're ingesting too much salt, I find that having multiple family members, especially the person who serves the meals, present during these discussions, because how the family eats is really how the individual is going to eat. And I think that having everybody participate in following a good diet is very important. And a lot of times that's not done if one family member is just eating whatever they want and the other one is trying to be very cautious. So it's got to be a family decision, I find, in terms of really getting people to follow the weight loss and the low salt intake.
I have another comment to make, which is all these risk factors, they reduce the blood pressure by incrementally. So if you reduce your alcohol, your blood pressure goes down by 4 points. If you reduce your salt, it goes down by 7 to 8 points. If you lose weight, it reduces your blood pressure by 5 to 8 points. If you eat a little bit of more potassium, which if you don't have kidney problem, you shouldn't worry about, you can actually lower your blood pressure by 4 to 5 points, and so on and so forth. So, and if you go by the sleep apnea studies, that is, if you actually have sleep apnea, you get a CPAP at night, you can reduce your blood pressure by up to 10 points. So, assuming that you are one person with several risk factors, and you are able to reduce 2 or 3 risk factors, not everything, but 2 or 3 risk factors, you could actually gain about 12 to 15 millimeters of mercury in your blood pressure. So if you started with 145 to 150, you could easily enter the range of 130 to 135. And in that case, you may not need a lot of medication to control your blood pressure. So the risk factors, even though each one of them doesn't give you huge numbers, but cumulatively, they give you a big number that you can work with.
So if you had what is so-called pot liquor, which is from collard greens, etc., and you don't have renal disease, that would be very good because that's high in potassium. Is Mr. Stark still on? Okay.
I'm
Dr.
still here,
Max-
Dr. Maxey.
Mr. Stark, I am impressed by your athletic career. And are you really 6'8", man?
Yes, sir.
Well, how do people in the NFL and you approach diet? Because it seems so important. You got to be a certain size to play football, but at the same time, the health guidelines apply to you as well. How do you recommend people maintain their healthiness from eating at the training?
Well, the biggest thing is that we've actually changed kind of over the last, I'd say 7 years, how we approach diet in the NFL. Because when I first came to the NFL, it was, all right, as long as there's nothing that's jumping off alarming, if everything's high, then okay. But you're just an athlete who just runs high in all the categories because you're bigger, you're stronger, whatever. diet wasn't really harped upon us. And I think in the last 6 to 7 years, there's been an earnest effect with the Players' Health Study from the former players' side, as well as with the NFL bringing in more of analytics and looking at all of these different diagnostics to try and gauge performance, that there's been more of an intent on healthier eating, more that, you know, they still promote higher protein, but different sources of where you get your protein, adding in vegetables, adding in beans as a protein supplement, instead of having red meat, to try and lower risk factors and get more legumes, more fiber into their diets, and monitoring those things and getting personal chefs who they have and doing food allergy panels. So the science behind it has changed over the last 6 to 7 years. And I've been retired for 6 years. So I was not truly a beneficiary of kind of that shift in how we approached diet, sleep. And, you know, like Dr. Seelfu said, was about having a CPAP machines. They now do sleep apnea studies for active and former players, because they know that there's a heart factor that's at risk when you're not sleeping properly, or you are too big, and you know your esophagus and your breathing tube is closing down because your tongue is too big. Like all of these other different things that we're now exposing to, trying to create more longevity in former athletes and former players, because they had seen a high incidence of people dying from stroke, heart attack, and other various heart-related conditions, and obesity, overweight conditions that create those chronic diseases. So it's been something that has really shifted, and you're seeing guys a lot healthier. I mean, to see a guy that was my size, I mean, 350 was more standard back when I played, and now offensive tackles are now around 310, 315. So just seeing that numerical number go down is big. And you're seeing guys that are slimmer in their uniforms, but we still got to get smaller. Once you retire, you have to lose that weight. You have to get down. And there's been more of a conscious effort as of late.
Well, thank you. I remember, and Dr. Neighbor's going to ask some questions, but I did a lecture tour with Joe Montana, and I was surprised how small he was, and skinny and tall, but he had been retired for a couple of years. But that's something. Dr. Neighbor? Dr. Neighbor, you're muted, I think. Can you unmute Dr. Neighbor, Simon?
I think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We have a question that came in from one of our other live streaming platforms, and we want to certainly let our participants on the other platforms know that we want to hear from them as well. And this question is related to what you were just talking about earlier, the diet changes. They want to know, how do patients factor the effects of nutritional supplements on the blood pressure readings?
So I can take that. So again, when we talk about diet, we're talking about salt. We're talking about your protein intake. We're talking about your caloric intake. So specifically in terms of high blood pressure, which is what we're addressing right now, the salt is the issue. If you're able to reduce your salt intake to less than 150 milliequivalents, that's what they write in the containers. It's always in MEQ. If you add all the MEQs, you shouldn't exceed 150 in 24 hours. That amounts to about 2 grams of salt in the diet. But many people don't know the relationship. That is why I'm stressing that. You just count this has 150, this has 20, the other one has 30, the other one has 50. You add them up in 24 hours, you have 150. That is basically your 2 grams. If you are really consuming more than that, it means that your salt intake is really very high. Now, as regards to other components of the diet, which is your high fiber, low calorie, and high protein diet, they may have to do with the other diets that have been described in the literature, the keto diet, and so on and so forth. I know that there were some publications talking about the keto diet and effects on health. There was also the Atkins diet and effects on health. People do, different kinds of diet, but the eventual goal is to get the salt as low as possible, to get the fiber as high as possible, and then to balance the protein and the carbohydrate. I think eventually that's what should happen to everybody. Get the salt as low as possible, get the fiber as high as possible, and get the calorie and protein to balance out. And I think if we're doing that, I think you'll fine. Now, having said that, there is a new, it's not really new, but there is what we call the plant-based diet, not plant diet. Plant-based diet. It's not vegetarian, not vegan, but it's plant-based diet. If you go on the website, you see a lot of plant-based diet websites. SUNY Downs, my university, has a plant-based diet website. It's really, really very good. If you want to understand what plant-based diet and its relationship to hypertension, diabetes, and heart disease is, I would recommend you go to Google, you type SUNY Downstate plant-based diet. It will give you a lot of information on that.
Thank you. Any other questions, Dr. Neighbor?
No, I think one of the questions was, Dr. Salafou, you talked about the blood pressure measurements in the office. One of the questions was, when should they be taken at home?
Oh, at home, preferably when you wake up in the mornings. We want to know the blood pressure at home when you wake up in the morning and also in the evening, but not every day. We want the measurements at least 3 days before you see a doctor, because we have to make adjustments. That is what's recommended by the new group. So if you get your blood pressure measurements like say 3 to 7 days before you see the doctor, you are really, really in good shape. Because the office blood pressure doesn't really help too much. We use it, if it's normal, we are happy, but if it's high, it's very hard to tell whether it's actually high or not. But the home blood pressure is the closest and most convenient, and we cannot hook up a 24-hour monitor to everybody all the time. So we are really stuck with the one thing that everybody can do and the patient can do, which is the home blood pressure monitoring. But the recommendation is to have it at least 3 days of measurements, morning and evening, in the same style that I measure. You sit nicely, you rest for 5 minutes, you take it in the left arm, wait for 2 minutes, do the second measurements, you take the average, and that's your blood pressure for the morning. And then the evening, you do the same thing. And then you do that for 3 days, you bring it to the doctor will have a real good assessment of your blood pressure.
And then Dr. Salafou, there was a question about, you talked about the relationship of lack of sleep and stress in your study on blood pressure. Would you care to expand that to the impact of social determinants of health on blood pressure?
Yes, we have. I mean, when we were doing the study, we collected all the social determinants of health measures. We really haven't published the study yet. We're still in the process of trying to finalize the analysis, but we have that information. And as soon as we analyze that, I'll be happy to come back to this forum and share that information. But it's the remarking thing is that these people who came from the Caribbean, all were known. We knew that when we actually measured them, they were normal blood pressure. When we actually measured them in the barber shop and the salons, we confirmed that they were normal blood pressure. Otherwise, they would never have made it to the study. And within 3 years, 34% of that population had high blood. They met criteria for blood pressure. That's really.
And we're all eagerly awaiting that. How long do you think it'll be before we can?
Maybe another couple of weeks, maybe 2-3 weeks.
Great.
Very good.
Finally, there's a question I'd like to throw to both of you. Or to either of you who want to take it on. Where do you think what is your understanding as to the current level of, or the current position of the debate around the role of bradykinin versus cytokinins in the etiology of the complications of COVID?
That's a question for Ms. Smith at Greater Zion Baptist Church, right?
No name.
I'm being funny.
Well, I mean, I can say that just for the people who are listening for the first time to this part of the topic, the COVID virus it has what we call the protein, the spike proteins on the wall. The spike proteins actually get connected to the cell before the cell can get infected. But it gets connected to the cell through the receptor called angiotensin II receptor. That's where this problem is. The angiotensin II receptor goes with the virus into the cells and it gets lost from the system. But there's a reason why it's there in the first place. It's there because it balances the angiotensin 1. So the angiotensin 1 is not too active, right? Not too active in causing hypertension. So if you remove that inhibitory effect of angiotensin 2, you have unbalanced angiotensin 1. The levels of angiotensin 1 go up relatively, and then you begin to squeeze your blood vessels. And that is one of the mechanisms for the thrombosis in patients with COVID, right? So the imbalance, the high level of angiotensin 1, the loss of angiotensin 2. So the question was, if you then break the angiotensin 1 by giving ACE inhibitors, would you be able to reduce the levels of angiotensin 1 and therefore prevent the thrombosis, the vascular injury and the thrombosis? And the answer is not settled. There was a European study that involved so many countries, and they found out that it didn't work out. There was another US trial involving Europeans and some Asian countries, large retrospective database study. You know, they said, you know, the use of ACE inhibitors was not recommended, but if the patient was already on ACE inhibitors while they got the infection and they had no reason to stop it, don't stop it. So that was their view. And then the last piece of evidence we're waiting for is from UC Davis. They are doing a study looking at a real randomized control trial, looking at the effect of ACE inhibitors on COVID progression, and we don't have the results yet. So that question, we are seeing the dark. Now, if you block ACE, of course, your bradykinin levels are going to go up. So we don't know what that's going to do. If you block the ACE, with the bradykinin then go and cause more vasodilation and cause more problems, and that issue too is not resolved.
Thank you.
I have one real quick. A couple of people wanted to know that website that had the plant-based diet. Do you mind repeating that?
SUNY, SUNY, SUI, SUNY Downstate. That is our university. SUNY, SUNY, then Downstate, DOWNSTATE, Downstate. Then you add plant-based diet. It will just pop up.
Okay, thank you.
Is Dr. Michelle Clark on? I'd like her to introduce next week's agenda, or is Dr. Nabrit, is she on, or you want to do that? Is Dr. Clark on? Dr. Nabrit, do you want to talk about next week's agenda?
Thank you. We are very pleased.
Okay. Yeah, I would say thank you, Dr. Maxey, and thanks to all of the excellent speakers this afternoon who brought us good wisdom and information. Next week, we have a program on depression, COVID, and African Americans across the lifespan. And I've gotten volunteers from the African American psychiatric scientific community to donate their time to discuss the impact of COVID on depression in African American adults, children and youth, and elders. I'm looking forward to an outstanding program and all of you participating in that. Short of that, anyone can contact me at any time if they have questions or concerns. I'm happy to connect you with providers in your community. I want to reach out especially to one of the participants who shared that she'd lost 2 relatives from COVID. So we must add her to our prayers, as well as all of those who are suffering from direct or indirect losses. It's been a hard time, it's been a hard year, but we have to maintain our hope, maintain our health, and maintain our faith. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clark. We appreciate you greatly. I'd like to thank again our magnificent speakers, Dr. Brown, Mr. Starks, Dr. Weiss, and Dr. Salafu. We have a company that we're affiliated with called biometrics, second opinion expert, and we are recruiting a group of 25 plus specialties. A lot of our listeners have expressed questions about the care and advice that they've received. So we did affiliate with this group called Second Opinion Expert. It's going to be free for the first 60 to 90 days, where you can submit your medical records and questions and have them reviewed by world-class experts to give you a second opinion. And these are world-class physicians that we will be presenting to you. And the link is on the blackhealthtrust.org website, and you can look forward to that being live now. We also have added a new web person, so we'll be exhibiting our new website as of another week, I'm told. And all of our lectures are up and cataloged. And we look forward to seeing you again next week. With going into the holidays, we do have a lot of issues with suicides and depression, but I'm told that it's the early spring that is the worst period of time for our population. So Dr. Nabert, do you have any final words or items?
My final words are the final words I say every week, and that is the triple W: wear your face covering, wash your hands, and watch your spacing.
And thank you to, again, our speakers. I'm so gratified that you took your time to give advice and counsel and your expertise to our listening audience. Again, we're here every Sunday at 12 noon Pacific, 3 o'clock Eastern, and I guess that's 2 o'clock in Central Time. Is Ms. Brenda Lee Yeager on? Okay. Do you have an affirmation, Michelle or Janelle? Well,
Yes.
go ahead.
Okay. Well, I thought I did. I'm sorry. It got away from me.
Yeah, Judy had one.
I can't find it.
Judy, are you on?
Yes, this is Judy. We had a affirmation that I put in the chat from Langston Hughes, and it was to, I'll have to paraphrase because I can't find it right now. And we asked you to hold on to your dreams, because without our dreams, we're like a bird without flight. So hold on to the dreams that you have and don't despair.
Okay. So again, thank you, everybody. Stay safe and believe that this pandemic is real. Protect yourself, protect your family and your children. See you next week. Thanks so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janelle.